This week's blog post is the third in my series on the Worcester Art Museum's American Portraits. It is also the final one in this series. For more on the Worcester Art Museum, see the first post in this series. In this post, we look at American paintings of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. This first one on the left dates to around 1830 to 1833. This unsigned work has been attributed to John Samuel Blunt, 1798 to 1835, a native of New Hampshire who was apprenticed from ages 14 to 21 in the workshop of John Brito Penniman, one of whose works we saw last week. In Penniman's studio, his tasks included gilding frames, ornamenting lamps, painting signs, and decorating ships' figureheads. Blunt later painted seascapes and did portraits in Boston and Worcester. At age 37, he died of yellow fever on a voyage from Texas to Boston. I've given you links in the blog post to more on Blunt. Scholars point out that Blunt's portraits are notable for their high finish and their fancy elements, which include in this painting on the left, the calling card, the bouquet of roses, and the coral necklace. To me, the clue that this artist hasn't had much formal training is the symmetry of the elements that appear in it. Look at the coral necklace, the neckline, the sleeves, the arms, even the note on the table. Human beings seldom arrange themselves in quite such an orderly manner. Next up, this one is around 1831. It's an unsigned portrait that might be the work of Blunt, whom we just saw, or of Edwin Plummer, 1802 to 1880, who also worked in Massachusetts in the 1830s. As in Blunt's portrait of Frances Motley, the artist is clearly more interested in simplifying forms into geometric shapes than in actually studying anatomy, for instance. But those nearly spherical leg of mutton sleeves, these, they're unforgettable. On the left is a portrait from around 1870 by Winslow Homer, whose dates are 1836 to 1910. Homer, a Boston native, is famous for New England seascapes, such as the one at the upper right. No fewer than 10 of his seascapes were on display in the 1893 Columbian Exposition in Chicago. But here he shows that he can convey a sitter's character as well, with what seems to me deliberate ambiguity. Is this school teacher stern, or is she merely anxious? The Worcester Art Museum's site notes that after the Civil War, women began to serve as teachers, and it was one of the first roles that they could take outside the home. And here we have a work from 1877 called Arrangement in Black and Brown, the Fur Jacket. This is by James Abbott McNeill Whistler, 1834 to 1903. He was born near Boston, but he went to Paris to study at age 21, then moved to London, and never returned to the U.S. Although he wasn't formally associated with the Impressionists, he actually refused an invitation to exhibit with them. His brushwork is reminiscent of Impressionist brushwork. In the 1860s, Whistler switched to a nearly monochromatic palette and to focusing on decorative arrangements of shapes and colors. The most famous of his paintings in this style is known as Whistler's Mother, or to give it the artist's title, Arrangement in Gray and Black No. 1, dates to 1871. Whistler was a leader of the aesthetic school, which challenged Victorian mores by aiming for beauty without any moral or social aims, art for art's sake. John Ruskin, 1819 to 1900, who was England's most revered art critic for some 30 years, accused Whistler of flinging a pot of paint in the public's face when he offered such works as the Nocturne on the right. In 1878, the year after the Worcester Art Museum's painting was done, Whistler sued Ruskin for libel. He claimed Ruskin's derogatory comments had damaged his sales. Whistler won the case, but he was awarded only a farthing, it's a very small amount of money, and he was forced to declare bankruptcy. The sitter for the Worcester Art Museum's portrait was Maud Franklin, Whistler's mistress and model, who bore him 2 daughters and was herself a painter. Next up, John Singer Sargent, whose dates are 1856 to 1925. Sargent was born in Florence of American expatriate parents, and he spent almost all his life in Europe, but he's still considered an American painter, and one of the most important ones of the 19th century. After studying in Paris, he rocketed to popularity as a portraitist, painting members of some of Britain's noblest and America's wealthiest families. Sargent had a flair and a bravura style that were and remain unique, and he always made his sitters look fabulous. Except the sitter here, Elizabeth Lizzie Dewey, a native of Worcester, Massachusetts, was 34 when this portrait was painted. She looks beautiful, but rather tired and worried. And that's so unusual for a sitter in a Sargent portrait that I looked her up to see if maybe she had died young. Nope, she lived to age 94. I would love to compare a photograph of her with Sargent's portrait, just to see what Sargent had to work with. Lizzie's husband, Francis Henshaw Dewey II, was a director of a bank, a railroad, and a telephone company. This is another Sargent portrait. If you're interested in the lives of the rich and famous, you should read the Wikipedia biography of Frances Evelyn Greville, whose nickname was Daisy. Her dates are 1861 to 1938. She was the wife of the 5th Earl of Warwick, mistress of the future Edward VII, and known as the Red Countess for her support of British socialists. Her unorthodox behavior was apparently the inspiration for the popular music hall song that dates to 1892, Daisy Bell. It won't be a stylish marriage, I can't afford a carriage, but you'll look sweet upon the seat of a bicycle built for two, apparently inspired by this woman. This is one of Sargent's very large canvases, an impressive 9 feet tall. In this detail on the right, you can see the flourishing brushwork. Sargent has increased the elegance of his sitter by elongating her figure. Photos of Lady Warwick make for a fascinating comparison. The Worcester Art Museum site points out that for this time, the outfit that she's wearing in the Sargent portrait is actually less extravagant than it might have been. And the last portrait in the series is from 1909. Frank Benson, 1862 to 1951, was born in Salem, Massachusetts, and he was trained in Paris. He became a founding member of The Ten, a group of American Impressionists from Boston and New York, which included Hassam, John Henry Twachtman, and Thomas W. Dewing. From 1889 to 1917, that is a lot of years, Benson taught at the School of the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston, influencing a generation of painters. The sitter in the Worcester Art Museum's portrait, Edith Purley Kinnicutt, was a leader in the women's suffrage movement. Her husband was a banker and broker. Chances are she's every bit as wealthy as most of Sargent's sitters, but in this painting she just doesn't have the verve of Sargent's sitters, does she? In fact, the only portraits Benson painted that come close to having the energy that Sargent's do are those that Benson painted of his children. I've given you links in the blog post to that. A word on why I did this series. For the Resurrecting Romanticism Conference in October 2023, I'm working on a talk about the 1893 Chicago World's Fair, known as the Columbian Exposition. One of the questions I'll be addressing is why the organizers of the exposition and the painters whose works appeared there are so very keen to surpass the buildings and the exhibitions of the 1889 Paris World's Fair. To remind myself of the development of European and American painting over time, this series of posts was a quick overview. Eventually I will post on other paintings at the Worcester Art Museum. If the history of Western painting interests you, check out my Innovators in Painting, a 140-page survey focusing on innovations that gave painters more power to make their viewers stop, look, and think about paintings. DianeDurantewriter.com has hundreds of posts on sculpture, painting, architecture, and my other obsessions. To join the Sunday Recommendations email list, visit the URL that's on the screen or email me. And you can say, "Well done, Diane," or support my work and receive rewards by means of the tip jar on DianeDurantewriter.com. As always, thank you for listening.